Morning, Paris. Lots of synergy with what I'm about to tell you with Yuval's talk, and I'm going to start by introducing you to Emma. So meet Emma. Emma lives the dream of many. She gets to travel the world and share her story, and she gets paid to do this. And she does this because she lives this dream of many, and she lives this dream because she does it through an audience that likes to see the world through her eyes. Emma is an influencer, and this is Emma's favorite hotel. So this is the St. Pancras Renaissance Hotel in London. Look how happy she looks, so candid on the bed with a full face of makeup and a book that she's never intending to read. But it's understandable to see why this is her favorite hotel, because it's beautiful and 4,000 people agree. But 4 weeks later, Emma finds herself at the South Place Hotel, and this is now her favorite hotel, and she looks even happier. And 2 weeks after this, she then finds herself at the Cotswolds, then she's at the Shangri-La, then she's back to the South Place. She ends up in the Cotswolds again before finishing at the Mayfair Hotel. Which one is Emma's favorite? Does anybody actually believe Emma here? No, I didn't think so. So why should her audience? Consumer trust in what influencers say has sunk to just 4%. And to put that into context, 35% of people believe in aliens and 16% believe in Bigfoot. Trust is the biggest challenge in influencer marketing today. And when you look at social conversation over the past 2 years, 4 of the biggest areas of growth have centered around authenticity, fake news, lies, and truth. Trust is the biggest challenge in advertising today. We've hit an all-time low. According to Edelman's Trust Barometer, advertising is now in last place behind banking, energy, and telecoms. This makes me incredibly sad. Why? Because bankers are considered more trusted than the people in this room. Let me repeat that. Bankers are considered more trusted than us marketers. But what does that mean for influencer marketing? Well, influencer marketing, it's fucked. And if you didn't like what I say there, I'd say look away now, because what I'm going to say is that influencer marketing is a bubble. So this is the anatomy of the bubble, and if you look through this chart here, we've had our takeoff, tick. We've got media attention, tick. Enthusiasm, greed, definitely. And I think we're approaching this point of delusion. We're approaching this tipping point. But despite this, you won't find a bigger advocate of influencer marketing than me. I'm Mike Blake-Crawford. I'm the strategy director at Social Chain. We're a global social media agency based in Manchester, but with offices in London, New York, Berlin, and Munich. And we work with some fantastic clients, ranging from Adidas to Amazon to Nokia and Apple Music. And as a result, we get a lot of press. A lot of the press focuses on the age of the business, only 4 years old, but also the age of the staff. So the Times has pointed out here, we've got an average age of 21, which might seem quite strange with me on stage, but when you see the guys back at the office, it begins to make sense how that's maintained. And I'm here today to talk about influencer marketing. More importantly, I'm here to share my tips of how to succeed at influencer marketing in a world where trust is at an all-time low. Because in this digital content world, where we can have anything, anywhere, at any time, it's really difficult to understand how to trust content because there's an absolute fuck ton of it. This is what happens in the average internet minute. 1 million people log on to Facebook, 700,000 hours of Netflix are streamed, 2.1 million snaps are created, and 1.4 million people are swiping on Tinder if anybody's trying to get lucky tonight. But we're suffering from content overload. So the average internet user in 2019 is actually a member of 8.5 social networks. They're multi-screening on up to 5 screens per day. And they're exposed across all media to around 4,000 adverts per day. Social media has become the proverbial digital Times Square. We don't know where to turn for sponsored ads, for influencers, branded content. And as a result, in addition to trust, the second most important currency in this new digital world is attention. But attention is a fickle beast. There's lots of things that factor into how attention works, filtration, environment. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to ask everybody to stand up. I've got something I just want to run through with you. You will get a chance to sit down, don't worry. But if everybody could please stand, I've got a few questions just to highlight the nuances of attention and what this means for brands. So the first question I'm going to ask, I'm going to say to you, sit down if you don't consider yourself a millennial. Okay, quite a few people down there. Why don't you consider yourself a millennial? Age? It's interesting, isn't it, how we pigeonhole ourselves into these different boxes and we decide to market to people based on these personas. It's very antiquated. That was just in there for a little bit of fun. The next one I'm going to ask is sit down if you don't have a Facebook account, which will be really interesting at a Social Bakers conference. Does anybody go down? No, a couple of people. You got a tinfoil hat as well, maybe? Or Interesting. Okay. Sit down if Facebook or Instagram weren't the two apps that you first opened when you woke up this morning. Okay, this is starting to sort it out a bit now. Right, a lot of people still standing. So you guys are the social media addicts, right? You can't cope without looking at that next story or liking that next post. Sit down if you don't remember the last 5 pieces of branded content you saw on social media. And there you have it. All of that attention, but absolutely no resonance. So attention is greatly influenced by filtration and environment. It's why when I showed you this slide before, all of your focus and attention hopefully was on me, and you didn't see that my Instagram account was on the back of Times Square there. And you also didn't see that my face was one of the icons here on this slide when I showed you that. So with that in mind, how do you cut through the noise? And the first thing I'm going to say today is a lesson for succeeding in influencer marketing, and marketing in general, is make people feel something. This face probably makes you feel something. It certainly makes me feel something, and that's the key. We need to go deeper than engagement. We look at these metrics, we measure our campaigns by video views, by reach, interactions, but ultimately the thing that really matters, the thing that makes people remember content, is how they feel about that content. It's the sentiment, it's the emotion. We've got to go deeper with our stories to connect with the way that people think and with their brains. This also probably makes you feel something. Apparently, this is the cutest dog in the world. And knowing that dogs make people feel something was an insight that we took into a campaign with a company called Lyst. Lyst are a fashion aggregator. They take listings from ASOS through to Prada and high fashion brands. And we saw this insight here, which said that Blue Cross had been revealing that the number of handbag dogs needing to be rehomed had increased by 120% over the last few years. So with that in mind, and with Lyst wanting to get some attention, we decided to create a campaign called the Canine Collection. The Canine Collection, it was a section on the website where you could pre-order a puppy in addition to your bags, dresses, and handbags. There was a product page, you could pick the size of the puppy. It even brought up the recommended complimentary handbags to go with the dog that you were ordering. We enlisted the help of some furry friends, we pressed our magic campaign button, and we started to get attention. But we needed the trust, so we utilized influencers to seemingly give that validation so this was an actual campaign. We used micro-influencers on Twitter to post pictures of them receiving their dogs, and people started to feel something, but what they started to feel was anger, it was hatred, and we even made the RSPCA, which is the leading pets protection charity in the UK, feel something, so much so that they had to respond with a campaign of their own. But alas, it wasn't a real campaign, and we did go back to all of the people that had pre-ordered a puppy and let them know that we were doing this to raise awareness of a good cause, but also to raise awareness of the brand itself. And it was really interesting to see that the people speaking about puppy farming the week before was only 150, whereas there was 10,000 mentions about this campaign in just 2 days. And that's the second lesson about this campaign, because it told a story, it had a very strong narrative. And ultimately, everybody loves a story, so you need to think about getting the story right, the narrative right to your campaigns, and telling them to the right people at the right time in the right place. You can't just expect to post a pretty picture like Emma and expect people to feel something about it and expect them to care. And this is an insight we took into some work that we did with Superdry. So we've been their social media agency for the past 2 years. One of the first things we did when we started working with Superdry was a lot of research, a lot of data. Started looking into their audience, did a lot of surveys, and one of the most interesting things that came back was this survey respondent who said, Superdry doesn't strike me as a brand that does whatever the fuck it wants. So what did we do? We let young people do whatever the fuck they wanted in Superdry clothing. And one of those people in particular was a guy called Nightscape. Nightscape is an urban explorer. We used him, we got him to wear Superdry, but we gave him the freedom to create the content that he creates naturally. The brief was very loose, and that's something that's very important when you're working with influencers. You don't want to dictate to them exactly how that campaign should look. And this campaign was hugely successful. We did it with 10 other influencers. And we generated 26 million impressions, 3 million engagements, and a 251% campaign ROI. But for me, that was not the greatest success. The greatest success was that this campaign got banned. It got banned because somebody complained to the ASA in the UK, so we had to pull all of the content from social. But we actually earned a lot of impressions and engagements just through the PR alone. And even though our PR company were quite concerned about this, for me, it was a great measure of success, because for a brand brand that didn't live these values, this was significant progress. So it's clear that influencers can have a huge impact on your campaigns and campaign success. And you can see by the investment in influencer spend, these are the forecasts for the next few years, and even at low ball estimates, it's anticipated to grow by $1 billion in the next 12 months alone. But what do good influencer campaigns look like? How are brands working with influencers? And there's no one better to look at than Red Bull. Red Bull, 20% of their content, a lot of it is product focused. It's Red Bull gives you wings, it's out of home, it's TV ads. But 80% of their content, it's people jumping out of spaceships. You know, Red Bull as a brand, they exist to sell products, but if you look at their content, hardly anything that they talk about actually tells you to buy something. What they're creating is interactive content, it's influencer-led content, it's extreme sports, it's fun, engaging, publisher-style content. And it all comes down to this. This is a quote that came from one of the Red Bull marketing directors that I absolutely love. And he said, ultimately, nobody is going to go to a website and spend 45 minutes watching a video about a drink. Exactly. Red Bull were one of the first modern brands to understand the value of acting like a publisher on social. And publishing to keep people's attention, it's nothing new. It's been happening for generations. You've only got to look at the Guinness Book of World Records from Guinness, and also looking at the Michelin Guide, which has obviously come from Michelin to get people to drive more and ultimately purchase more tires. And influencers have our attention, but Red Bull noticed that, you know, it's not just attention and followers that indicates a strong social media strategy. You need to forget this, the follower number, and that's something that a lot of people have been conflating with an influencer actually having influence. And there's a really good example came out in the press a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure if anybody saw it, but there was this influencer, I forget her name, but she had 2.6 million followers. She set up her own fashion brand, her own website and Instagram account, and she used her audience to push the sales for this. But she couldn't sell 36 products that she needed to commence the production run. So 2.6 million followers, but she couldn't sell just 36 units. So this is a really good example of how having that huge follower number doesn't necessarily equate to success in influencer marketing and action off the back of it. But you look at how Red Bull activate, they look for influence in the way that people exhibit the brand values. You know, they work with people that live on the edge. It's all about giving people wings. It's exciting content. And they support those talented people to ultimately give the audience what they want and what they want to consume. It's exciting. It's what people want to engage with. But most importantly, they do this consistently. And that's lesson number 3. Think like a publisher, look beyond those vanity metrics and work with people that represent your brand's values and do this consistently. Well, Red Bull are a great example, but of course Red Bull can do this. They've got a fantastic brand equity, and an incredible message about living on the edge. But what about other industries? We work quite closely with a number of fashion brands. We work with the Boohoo Group. If anybody doesn't know who they are, they're an e-commerce fast fashion company that are worth £2 billion at last estimates. And as this BBC article says, a lot of their success has actually been driven by influencer marketing, social media marketing, and in particular, they've done a lot of work with the Kardashians. This post in particular in 2016, which was with Kylie Jenner, it achieved over 2 million likes, hundreds of thousands of comments, but it cost $250,000 just for 12 hours. Then she removed it from her Instagram page. So in terms of driving that sustainable ROI, it just was never going to work. So when we started working with Boohoo and Pretty Little Thing, what we started looking at was actually an ROI-driven micro-influencer campaign. So rather than attracting these top-tier influencers, we started working with girls that had followings between 10K to 100K. But the key thing was we grouped them into individual groups and we incentivized them to drive traffic through to the website. They had individual UTM tracking codes for Google Analytics. Some of them even had bespoke landing pages. But ultimately, by bringing them in and giving that incentivization, what we saw was huge success, but the critical thing that we saw was that there was no correlation between the audience size and the revenue that was generated. It was all to do with the engagement. What was the impact of this campaign? It was a 30 times ROI, but most importantly, it had a really lasting impact on driving community growth, not only amongst the influencers themselves, but also for their followers and followers of the brand. Guess how much the influencer with less than 100 followers generated in terms of revenue? It was $76,000. So lesson 4 is to share your success. When working with influencers, don't just look at influencers as a media channel. Look to involve them, give them value, give them incentives to be part of what your brand is trying to do. And finally, coming on to some of the biggest questions that are challenging influencer marketing at the moment, a lot of those focus around costs. What exactly are people buying when it comes to influencer marketing? And a lot of the focus is on traditional metrics. It's reach, it's follower size, cost per view, cost per engagement. How should I be benchmarking my influencer campaigns? What you need to understand is what you're actually buying is endorsement, it's audience, it's the creativity of that influence that's going to drive the value. Those are the things you need to consider rather than the traditional media metrics, because this is not the same as buying media, and influencers just should not be treated in that way. So what you need to start looking at is actual audience reach, true engagement rate, which is something that you can actually get from social bakers, industry averages, supply and demand, but ultimately what you're asking them to create, because it's the creative execution that truly adds the value. And finally, trust is another big challenge for influencer marketing at the moment. There's been a lot of negative press recently about influencer marketing, around fake followers, around efficacy and ROI, attribution and costs, and a lot of it's focusing around this influencer fraud, because at the moment, it's kind of like the Wild West. It's still very new. Influencers aren't the most commercially savvy people, but the industry overall is under a lot of pressure. People are actually getting death threats in response to some of the campaigns that they're undertaking, which is not what anybody wants to see. And while brand safety is a concern in influencer marketing, you can't expect to wrap influencers in cotton wool and restrict them from their campaigns, because ultimately, working with influencers is no risky than working with a bad idea. And you've only got to look at Pepsi last year. They used one of the biggest influencers in the world, but nobody talked about that. They talked about how shit the idea was, ultimately. So influencers actually allow brands to be braver in their communication, because rather than dictating what they say and communicating as the brand themselves, you're actually talking about you, but you're letting influencers talk about you in their own way. So following all of these steps that I've been giving you so far, so thinking like a publisher, looking beyond vanity metrics, working with people who actually represent your values and doing this consistently, this is one step to help building trust within influencer marketing, because people are rejecting the perfect picture. They're rejecting people like Emma, who we saw at the very start. We live in this age of authentic communication, and brands that don't deliver this authentic influencer experience, they risk a backlash. There's everything on social media can be faked, from likes, from comments to shares, and influencers are fully aware of this, and a lot of them are actually utilizing these tools, these dark arts, to portray themselves as an influencer, and the lines between what is real engagement and fake engagement, it's actually starting to blur. And at Social Chain, we had a hypothesis that a lot of Instagram influencers, a lot of their engagement, if it was real, would look something like this. It would be a steady chart of an engagement that was accumulating over time. And what we thought was that with a lot of these apps where people can purchase engagements, what we'd start to see were jumps in engagement like this. So we put this hypothesis to the test. And I'm going to play a short video from our founder, Steve Bartlett, which gives a bit more explanation as to what this tool is. And that will play through now.
Fraud. Wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain. The marketing industry will spend $1.6 billion on Instagram influencers this year alone, and that shows no sign of slowing down. By 2020, global influencer spend will be between $5 and $10 billion. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how and why this industry is home to one of the biggest, most elaborate, widespread scams in the history of marketing, and why this year alone, if you've worked with influencers, the chances are you've been part of a scam that's cost you and our industry hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Earlier this year, the CMO of Unilever, Keith Weed, announced the following.
So we've made a commitment that we will not work with influencers, creators who buy followers.
This triggered a huge industry debate, and one brand after another followed suit. But there were still questions unanswered. How do you define influencer fraud? How do you identify influencer fraud? And most importantly, how do you avoid it? At Social Chain, we dedicated the last 6 months of our global resources to building an AI tool to try and solve this very complex and misunderstood challenge. The conversation always centered on influencers' follower numbers, but the follower number means nothing Other marketeers use the engagement per post as a method of identifying how influential a creator is. Currently, this is the most common way of deciding what to pay an influencer. However, there are now hundreds of apps that allow you to buy likes, views, and for a couple of dollars, you can buy and write your own comments. If you can fake it for a few dollars, it's not worth paying attention to. Forget the engagement number. 6 months ago, we set out to build an industry-first tool to protect marketeers. The purpose of this tool is to identify how much of an influencer's engagement is real and how much of it is being faked. We call this their true engagement. What we discovered was deeply, deeply disturbing. In simple terms, the tool collects data from all of the largest engagement bot farms. It builds a database of tens of millions of fake profiles that these apps use to fake engagement. It then simultaneously scans hundreds of thousands of influencers to see which influencers are getting engagement from these apps. When it identifies suspicious activity, it produces an engagement graph for that influencer and uses AI technology to benchmark their engagement over time against real organic engagement graphs. It understands what paid promotion looks like, shout-outs, and other known algorithmic factors. This is how engagement should look on a post when it's organic. Here is the engagement graph of a fashion influencer that our tool alerted us to. For her privacy, I'm going to call her Jess. Jess has 230,000 followers. She's been paid by 22 different brands this year via agencies that book her for her apparently high follower number and engagement rate. She charges $1,000 per post. However, 96% of her engagement is fake, produced by a bot farm that charges $2 for 1,000 engagements. That means $960 out of that $1,000 that 22 different brands gave her this year was scammed.
Pretty powerful stuff. I mean, how many people in the audience are aware of this and that this has been happening and are measuring this as part of their campaigns? It's quite a few of you, but still quite a lot of people that aren't aware of this. Influencer marketing fraud is a huge, huge challenge for the industry. And funnily enough, when we checked our old friend Emma from the start and started to look at some of her content, it was no surprise to start seeing these irregularities in terms of the engagement that she was receiving. It happened again and again, looking at all of her different pieces of content. All of the engagement was ultimately faked and purchased through a lot of these apps. So we're now monitoring all of the influencers that we work with to ensure that all of them are not, they're not using these apps, and we're also using tools like Social Bakers to help us identify influencers that are generating the right engagement with the right affinities with the right audiences. So lesson 6 is ultimately to be vigilant, develop and invest. By being vigilant and developing through process and investing in the right tools, you can protect yourself from the dangers of influencer fraud. So to recap those 6 points, make people feel something. Ultimately, you need to drive emotion and sentiment behind your campaign. Simply paying people to post a picture with your product is never going to work. It's never going to get you the resonance that you require. Context is what makes good social stories great. So having a strong narrative within a campaign, thinking like a publisher when working with talent, and creating content that people ultimately want to see. A really good tool for finding this is Social Bakers Inspiration, and it's really interesting to see some of the top performing pieces of content across various different markets, and using that as a baseline for creative ideation. Look beyond vanity metrics when working with people who represent your brand's values. So it's not about the follower number. It's not actually about the engagements, as we've seen with some of these influencers. Even that influencer with 2.6 million followers was unable to drive actions off the back of that audience. Doing this consistently makes it possible to deliver a clear ROI. So focusing on micro-influencers and creating campaigns where you can share the success and bringing them on board is highly successful. But most importantly, don't fall victim to influencer fraud. And that brings me to the end of today's presentation. Anybody got any questions potentially in the audience if we've got time? No? We'll leave it at that then. Fantastic. Thank you for your time, guys.